let's go ahead and get started. So I'm Rochelle Wilhite. I'm the designated broker and owner of Best Choice Realty. And today it was really apparent that we definitely want to cover Form 17 law and go over the forms that are related to disclosures, because there were some changes. We didn't read the NWMLS bulletin. Some of us are in Spokane, I've noticed. So you wouldn't probably see the bulletin, but the forms did change, the disclosures, Form 17. And there were some slight changes, but overall, we need to make sure that we're using the right forms. And then just a quick review about Form 17. So that's what we're going to cover tonight. We have about 30 minutes. And if you have a question, you can certainly chat in the chat window, and I will get to your questions today. If there is something specific that you want me to discuss, you can certainly call me after this and we can talk about your specific situation separately. But otherwise, we'll keep it rolling today. So let's go to the next slide, Shannon. So I'll just talk to you briefly. There are still just the 3 Form 17. So if Shannon can go to the Northwest MLS, let's make sure even our newer brokers know where to find them. You would go into your Northwest MLS and you would find the 3 Form 17s. There are 3. One is for land, one is for commercial, and one is for residential. So there's land, vacant land, commercial, and then your residential. So all 3 of those, if you can see, the commercial Form 17 did not get changed. However, the other improved property and unimproved property did change. So that's Form 17 and Form 17C. So if you want to click on that, there's also a manual. A lot of new brokers didn't realize there's a manual on the right side. So if you're ever wanting to know what is that manual, what is the required by state law, maybe you could answer some of the questions on your own. I self-taught. A lot of the things I teach is because I've put a lot of this manual into practice with many transactions over the years. And so this has been helpful for me to almost self-teach myself and highlight it if I'm wondering about a certain form or where I sign. That's where I would go, is looking at the manual. If you are looking for some helpful tips, that's also a great place. Most of the forms have a manual that's associated with it. Back to the slide. So the answer to the question, how many Form 17s are there in the state of Washington? There are 3. Next question. Where do my clients need to sign? So many people are wondering about that, especially as we are having some challenges in the marketplace where we're in a multiple offer situation. How do I advise my clients about where to sign? So we'll start with the buyer first, since many of you have worked with buyers. The last page is where the buyer signs. The buyer does not sign anything page 1 through 5. The buyer would sign on the last page. There's acknowledgement. That's where, so it's halfway down the line. There's an acknowledgement, and there are 3 locations that a buyer needs to sign or consider signing. The first one is in number 1 is like right here where it says A, B, C, D, E, and F. And what the buyer hereby acknowledges is A, B, C, D, E, and F. And they have a 3-day right of rescission if they only sign on number 1. So Shannon can highlight 285 through 287. That says that the buyer shall have 3 days from the date that the seller or the seller agent delivers this. So if their listing agent does a poor job, but the seller indeed gives the buyer the disclosure statement, then the buyer has 3 days from the date of receipt. Most brokers, most listing agents provide the Form 17 in the supplement. If they do, and you get that, and you're in a multiple situation, you definitely want to have the buyer sign on number 1.
Into Longview.
But you also may want to have
No, because I was coming the opposite direction. But when we went out, it had just started to pile.
There we go. So you've got some choices when it comes to a multiple offer situation as to where the buyer needs to sign. I don't want you guys having your buyer sign on the waiver number 3. The only time I want you using number 3 is when a Form 17 is not provided by the seller. or they're dealing with a foreclosure, short sale, bankruptcy sale, those types of sales where there is not a Form 17 on file, and your buyer still indeed wants to proceed with the purchase and sale. That would be the requirement in our firm, is to have that waiver in place. But that's not what number 2 is. So number 2 is when the buyers have reviewed the entire Form 17 in a multiple offer situation. We see this a lot where the listing agent puts it in as a supplement. The supplement is then in the MLS. And then the buyer's agent has to pull down the legal description, the 22K, some of these other addenda. And then they see, oh, the listing agent uploaded the Form 17 for us. We then have 3 days from the right. So we, during that, give your buyer some time. If they're not reviewing offers until Monday and you show the property on Friday and you're working, the offer out, the Form 17 is separate from the offer. It is not part of the offer. However, it kind of goes in conjunction. A seller who is looking for the best offer wants to know that the buyer has done their due diligence and reviewed the Form 17 in its entirety, and then made a decision on whether they wanted to waive the right to revoke the offer, that 3-day from the seller's delivery of the Form 17. So what the listing agent is asking for is the buyer's waiver of the right to revoke the offer, which is number 2. So in that circumstance, when you're in a multiple offer situation and your buyer has had time to review the Form 17 in its entirety, only then would you advise that they sign on number 1 and number 2. We had a rookie broker who basically came to me after several months and said, Rochelle, why am I not getting my offers accepted? And I told him, you probably want to make sure that you have your offer in one PDF. And then the second PDF, you need the Form 17, and you probably want to have the buyer sign on number 1 and on number 2. And that's a separate 2 PDFs in the email. He's like, I haven't been doing that for months. My other broker, we won't name any names from other company, never advised of what to do or where to have my buyer sign. So a simple little training like we're having tonight can get you up to bat and hopefully get you your buyer a property in a very challenging marketplace right now. So number 1, just all the time we have a receipt in the file. That's what we're looking for the buyer. Number 1 and number 2, multiple offer where you don't want the 3 days of right to rescind, and only sign number 3 when we are dealing with a bank-owned foreclosure, that type of property where there is not a Form 17 provided. Okay, so let's go to the next question. And the seller needs to sign off on all of the pages. Somebody asked a question to me, does a seller need to sign? Yes, the seller initials all the pages. Don't forget, even page 6 needs to be initialed by the seller, and the seller signs as well. Their full signature goes on the Form 17. Who is exempt? This is a test question from contract negotiation. I could have a poll. I don't have the poll. It is in the contract negotiation class, but who is exempt are people that are in an estate situation, and also bankruptcies, sales are exempt. Foreclosures are not exempt. New construction is not exempt, but they are taken different way of having the buyer sign for receipts of those types of things. So there really is only 2 exemptions. There also is an exemption. Let's say you were I was selling to my son or my daughter a property, transferring ownership when there's a blood or legal correlation. There is an exemption for that, but pretty much the rule of thumb is if they are in an estate, not a living trust, that's a different situation, and they must provide a Form 17. But who is exempt? Estates and bankruptcy sales. That's it. And so and a lot of people say, well, I have not lived on the property in a long time. Then you need to answer the questions appropriately. If a seller came to me and said, I haven't lived there, maybe only lived there for a portion of the time, they just need to make sure they indicate that on page 1 of the Form 17, whether they occupy or don't occupy. And I would assume that maybe many of the questions that they asked, they might have to indicate that they don't know because they have not lived in the property. So again, if there's not sure about the question, Maybe they speak a different language. I get that question often asked, like, they speak a different language. They don't know what first right of refusal is. Maybe it doesn't translate well. In that case, it would be better for the seller to say that they don't know than to say no, and then they find out there is a first right of refusal, and now there's a more complexity and obviously legal things that you have to deal with something like that. The next question I often get is, how do you communicate with the other agent when there is something not filled out correctly? I don't know about you, but when everybody's moving so fast and you're a listing agent and that seller hurries and scrambles and throws a bunch of check marks on this page, there are things that are being missed. And if I saw a Form 17 and I was a buyer's agent, and let's just say, I wish I had an example because there's been plenty I've seen in the last week even, where there was like number 5 completely left blank. There wasn't even not applicable. I had a seller that just left that entire section blank, 5A. And also on section 4F, they checked the box, don't know, but then they put all of these defects. They checked some like the driveway, and they didn't really explain. It says anytime that there's a starred item on any of the Form 17, there needs to be an explanation if the answer is yes. Oftentimes, they don't put any more clarification on that. So when you're representing the buyer, you really need to take heart, because your buyers are looking to you as a consultant, as an advisor. You certainly don't have legal, as far as that goes, you're not legally bound to the Form 17, but you know what? You can stop a lot of things from happening to that buyer after the close of escrow by simply asking questions. The way I would do that, let's use this for an example. Let's just say that section on the, I think it was number 4, Shannon, if you want to go to page 4. Let's just say that everything was answered yes, no, or don't know, but they forgot to fill out the section where it talks about structural. They forgot to indicate, they said don't know, and then they checked a bunch of boxes, and they did not even provide what was wrong. Like, there should have been more clarity on like what was going on with that, let's say the driveway. There was some things that were happening with that driveway. And so you have, you're a buyer's agent and you represent the buyer in such a way where you almost want to call that listing agent and say, what the hell? Why is the seller not filling this thing out correctly? But yet you don't want to upset the apple cart. You want to make sure that that you protect your buyer and that you have that Form 17 in essence updated, or as much as you can, so that you could potentially waive that right to revoke the offer in a multiple offer situation. So in that case, what you would do is you would contact that listing agent in writing. An email would be appropriate. Let's say that we have this Form 17 has not been filled out. There's 4 section which says, had the roof leak within the 5 years? They said yes. And there are some defects that they said they don't know about, but yet they checked some boxes where we need some further clarification. In that case, I would email the listing agent and say, my buyer is very serious about your property. We are in the process of putting together an offer for the offer review date. I've attached the Form 17. My buyer would like clarity on section 4A and 4F. Could you please have the seller reply to this email and give us some more knowledge about these defects? And that's how you would communicate. It's not you asking for your buyer. It's the buyer has asked me to ask you, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, Mr. and Mrs. Listing Agent, to complete. And again, we're very nice in how we ask for that to be done. Would you please be so kind in providing some more information and clarity on that section of the Form 17? You want to keep that inquiry, you want to keep that email in your records, because let's say you get mutual acceptance and there was some clarity or some adjustments or some more knowledge that were provided to you and to your buyer in terms of the structural issues. And let's say down the road, they close escrow, everything's done, and we find out there's massive slippage on the driveway. The driveway is even worse than they had it explained, and they misled us and the repair is going to be over $5,000 to get that fixed. That's when the buyer would contact their attorney, use that email that you drafted, provide that to their attorney along with the Form 17 and attempt to basically sue for that $5,000 repair bill. But if you had not asked, inquired, and got more information, they may not have that option after the close of escrow because of the way that the seller filled out the section 4F, and they said they don't know. Anytime a seller says don't know and you're a buyer's agent, your buyer needs to get further knowledge. They need to maybe hire an inspector. They may need to call the county or the city or the title company, or they may need to contact the homeowners association or whatever it is to figure out for themselves, buyer beware, on is it a yes or a no or a don't know, to try to understand that a bit more. So be very cautious when you're communicating with the listing agents, because that also gets compiled when a complaint is filed or when you have an issue with an attorney after the close of escrow. That becomes very critical. Let's go to the next slide, Jim. Okay, it's a long answer for a short question. When should the sellers provide the information? Sellers should provide the Form 17. They have 5 days. Some sellers are so busy trying to get their house on the market that they fail to get the Form 17 filled out and over to their realtor, their real estate broker. So what they'll want to do is you'll want to get in a habit of getting that Form 17 kind of in the process of when you're taking photography or when you're getting the marketing set up. Send that over to the seller or provide them with that copy so that they can easily fill it out. There is a very easy way to send it to them through Transaction Desk. If you want to know how to do that, it's a simple check of the box when you're in Transaction Desk and you upload the Form 17 into the forms. You can email that form, just the form itself. Just make sure that you allow for editing. It's a very simple checkbox. It took me about 6 months to figure that out. Where that checkbox was. So if you have a question about that, let me know. If you want to start introducing your Form 17 to your seller earlier, it would be much better to have them actually use their computer to check the boxes. It becomes, sometimes when you're scanning and you're kind of moving things around, those checkboxes sometimes get not filled out or they get kind of blurred. I mean, I would rather see it on a computer than I would see hand done, but you know what? At the end of the day, it's whatever is easiest for that seller. So they should provide that Form 17, in my opinion, right at the time of the listing, because I want to know what the seller knows about the property. The rule, though, on the Form 17 is to provide it within 5 days of mutual acceptance. So if you are working on a file and you have not provided that Form 17, shame on you, Mr. or Mrs. Listing Agent, for not providing that disclosures so that you can kind of check that off your list and receipt it, but you do have some time after mutual. I wouldn't like to have a lot of time because that, somebody could back out for any reason using the Form 17 if they're not provided it right away. So I would highly advise you do it right at the time of listing, but the rule of thumb is 5 days. It must be before 5 days after mutual. So the next slide. Attorney involvement. So yes, at any point in time, you should be confident in saying if your clients have a question about this easement, maybe that the sellers had discussed. I'm not, an easement specialist. I can certainly put them in touch with an attorney or that handles easements, or get more clarity or knowledge about the easement by talking with the title company. First, call the title. But in an email, anytime your buyer asks you a question about the Form 17, you really have to be, there's only certain things that you can answer. Other than that, you really should advise that they speak with their attorney or somebody that has the knowledge to answer those questions for them, or pose that question to the seller who ended up filling out that Form 17. So that's kind of what you are. You're the communicator. You're the one that's trying to seek out this information based on your buyers, what they're looking to, to buy. And you should always advise that a seller fill it out completely transparent, everything that they know about the property. Do not lie, do not mislead, because at the end of the day, that could come back and haunt them after close of escrow. if the seller, if they're asking, well, I don't feel comfortable, I need you to explain this to me, I cannot. Unfortunately, this document is separate from the purchase and sale agreement. That is the way you need to answer that question. If you have questions about how to fill it out, you should seek an attorney to advise you on how to fill this out. And many people, especially commercial, have asked their attorneys, their law firms, to advise them on how to fill it out, or they've given them the authority to fill it out. So there are some ways that you can overcome that and keep yourself clean so that you're not having some difficulty in the future. But yeah, be very careful. If the seller asks you, I need you to fill it out, the answer is no, I cannot fill that out for you. You'll need to speak with an attorney or somebody that has the knowledge to give you assistance in filling this out. Okay, next slide. What effective changes do we need to be worried about? So there were some changes, enough in the state of Washington when they changed the RCW code that did inflict more change on the Form 17 form. So I'm going to have Shannon go ahead and open up the red lines so I can go over the changes that were made. Anytime a change is made to a form, you'll notice the REV that was revised. Literally, it happened today. So you will see the new Form 17s that are loaded in Transaction Desk for you to utilize. The biggest thing is where it talks about who, new construction and dwellings in residential common interest community are not subject to a public offering statement. That was a new change that had to be made to the Form 17. And then if you scroll down, you'll notice that they made some changes to, that's kind of more a tidy up, just property. It's not in caps, that's kind of silly. But in section K, this has to do with the covenants or deed restrictions based on race, creed. They added some information there that because of the RCW code that changed 49.60.224 in terms of the covenants restrictions that many people are concerned with when it comes to race and creed. So they reference the RCW code. So that is something that seller needs to understand, that there are covenants, restrictions recorded against the property, and they are also referenced here. Notice to the buyer that they need to reference the different kind of covenants and they need to look at that and read that. So as a buyer's agent, if they come to me and say, Rochelle, can you read the CC&Rs and determine whether I'm okay? You cannot answer that question. You need to suggest that they spend some time in the evening, read it. If they don't know what it means, they need to seek an attorney to advise them on their CC&Rs. Next question or next change they made was when it came to the internet service. With the pursuant to RCW, it talks about internet service and providers of internet service. There is a section which I think, especially in the outlying areas where I have worked in the past, super frustrating when I check the box. Yes, it's connected to the internet, but yet I find out Comcast does not service that area. And so this would be an opportunity for a seller to declare, no, this does not have internet service, or yes, it does, and here is the provider, so that we don't have any room. There is a couple of transactions actually from that Best Choice Realty has conducted in the past, I would say 6 months, where attorneys have been involved, and unfortunately, there's nothing that can be done. It really comes down to the seller and the buyer and what was translated into the listing. And there hasn't been, up until now, a place where the seller could provide who the provider of their internet service was and a declaration so the buyer can decide whether that's sufficient for them or not. Some people work from home. So this obviously came from the work from home concept, and due to COVID, people moving out into the outlying areas outside the cities where maybe internet service is quite spotty. And they, because of loss of work and issues with their job, they have then contacted their attorney after the close of escrow and have sued the seller or sued, there's been a lawsuit that's been formed. Luckily for us, we've been able to overcome the couple that we've had to deal with, but it has not been for a lack of communication of what was provided, what was declared, how was the listing provided, what was disclosed, and what did the buyers have knowledge about, what did the sellers have knowledge about, and was there misrepresentation by the agent? Luckily, there has not been, and we haven't got ourselves in any trouble. but certainly something you want to point out for that listing agent or for that seller who's indicating that they have to disclose. They need to disclose properly and not mislead. Another section that was changed, lead-based paint, that was a cleanup where it's like they check the box, not applicable if it's built prior to 78. That was kind of confusing. Shannon, if you want to go down to that section. It's like we're already providing lead-based paint disclosure, right? But then there's this Form 17 that a lot of people are like, well, this is kind of a duh. So there is a section that you can check the box if it's not applicable if your home is built after 1978. What happens when there is a change to the Form 17 during a transaction? So again, you and I, when you represent the listing, when you're a seller's agent or you're a buyer's agent, when there's a change to the Form 17, we have to go ahead and provide that to the buyer. So let's say we represent a seller, and let's say that they had a roof leak. We're coming up on the fall and winter season, which we actually tend to have more water, more rain. And let's say that we're in contract and the sellers answer the question, have there ever been a roof leak since their ownership? And initially, when we sent over the Form 17, it said, no, we have not had a roof leak. But let's say we're already 2 weeks into the transaction and they actually have a roof leak. We are required as listing agents to provide an updated Form 17 disclosure to that buyer with that new knowledge. What that will do, though, is it will trigger the buyer to authorize that that's okay. So when that happens, the buyer does have the right to terminate unless they have waived their right to revoke. If they've waived their right to revoke, it becomes very muddy, and that's where an attorney would need to get involved and advise on whether the buyer has the right to terminate due to a Form 17 change. I've had some attorneys that have said that they can terminate the contract, and I've had some attorneys that say that they cannot. Again, I don't practice law in that way. We are just providing the information and letting the attorneys duke it out when it comes to those types of situations. But it is your responsibility to make sure that the parties prior to closing are aware that there was a change made to that Form 17 and then get their authorization. It could be a simple, just initial, or it could be a Form 34 that's done to let the parties know that section 4 about the roof has been, modified as follows, and both buyer and seller initial that. So there's knowledge and there's acceptance by both buyer and seller, by both parties, that there was a change made to the Form 17 prior to closing. Okay. I think that was it. Shannon, was there any other chats that came in or things I did not cover?
Two really great questions came through. One of them is from Carl, is if my seller has already filled out the Form 17, we're not on the market yet, do they have to fill out a new Form 17?
That's a great question. Are they, so they're not on the market, but there's a signed listing agreement?
That's what I would assume from his message.
Yeah. Then, it's always best to use the most recent version of the disclosure form. So the answer, I would say, to be safe, Carl, would be yes, but make it easy for that seller so that they can quickly, give them a sample of what they've already filled out on the other one. As you can see, there was not a substantial amount of changes, but certainly ones that I think would be appropriate, especially if we're not live on the market yet. Make it as easy as possible so that they have a copy of what they have signed, and then just give them the new one and just tell them to go down the line and quickly fill it out again. I think it would serve his sellers well to know that we're up to speed with the new laws and the new changes. And certainly if an attorney was looking at a situation where it's like, okay, you listed the property on such and such a date, but the forms were revised on August 16th. Can they make sense of the old one on August, 1st, for example? Probably, but would it serve the buyer and the seller well to have it updated? Yes. So best scenario, I think, Carl, would be to go ahead and have them just do it again. Make it easy for them, though.
And another question that we had was, do sellers have to update the Form 17 after an inspection? I'm assuming a pre-inspection or during the course of 35R?
So that's would be negotiated in a contract. So in essence, they're proceeding on the 35 knowing this type of information. So the buyer, if you're negotiating, say the roof needs a repair and the buyer's inspector found that out, then in essence, the sellers were correct. There was not any kind of leak that they had identified, but the buyer brought that to their attention. So in that case, the buyer found that piece of information, which became their own personal knowledge, and they're negotiating, asking the seller to repair it. In that case, there would not need to be an adjustment made to the Form 17. But if there's something that came out of the negotiations, let's say, for example, we did not fix the repair item and there was a roof, then yeah, you probably do want to update your Form 17, or at least let the sellers know that, you know, we are aware of it, but we are updating our Form 17 to reflect that. We would also have emails that kind of explain that situation. So it would be a case by case, certainly something I'd rather take up with you one by one, rather than just make a blanket statement on our YouTube recording here on something like that. So I'd say case by case on that one.
Okay, sounds good. That's all the questions that we had come through.
All right, we'll let you guys get to your evenings. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a wonderful week.